The temperature inside Alban Lundberg's cabin had dropped to 15 degrees below zero, and his children huddled under every blanket the family owned while he burned the last chair for heat. 3 miles across the snow-buried prairie, Zacharias Sjöström's family sat comfortably in their underclothes, a small fire crackling in the hearth, surrounded by walls that his neighbors had called insane. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier survival and forgotten innovations move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The winter of 1872 took Ebba Sjöström on the coldest night of January, and Zacharias watched helplessly as frost formed on the interior walls of his cabin while his daughter's breathing grew shallow and stopped. She was 5 years old. She had complained of feeling cold 3 days earlier, but every child felt cold that winter. The Dakota Territory was experiencing temperatures that settlers had never encountered in their homelands of Sweden and Norway. 40 degrees below zero became normal. 50 below was not uncommon. The wind came from the north without mercy. Zacharias had built his cabin in 1870 using techniques he learned from other settlers. The structure was 16 feet by 24 feet, with walls 8 feet high. He had notched the corners properly, using the saddle joint method that every homesteader knew. The logs were reasonably straight pine, cut from scattered timber along the creek 4 miles south. He had chinked the gaps between logs with mud mixed with grass, the standard approach. 3 windows provided light, 2 flanking the front door and 1 small opening in the upper gable. Small wooden steps led to the door, just 3 risers above ground level. By frontier standards, it was a good cabin, better than many. Some settlers still lived in sod houses or dugouts carved into hillsides. Zacharias had invested significant labor in proper log construction. The roof was solid with overlapping planks and sod. The chimney drew well, built from collected stones and clay mortar. The door fit snugly. The windows could be shuttered against storms. But on the night of January 23, 1872, none of that mattered. The temperature outside reached 53 degrees below zero. The wind screamed across the prairie at speeds that made the cabin shudder. Zacharias burned wood continuously, feeding the fireplace every hour. The flames provided light and some heat, but warmth never reached more than 6 feet from the hearth. The corners remained frozen. Frost grew on interior walls where gaps between logs allowed cold air to seep through the chinking. The 3 windows, despite being shuttered, leaked frigid air around their frames. Ebba slept in the corner farthest from the fireplace, where Zacharias and Lovisa had placed the children's beds away from sparks. Wilhelm, 8 years old, and Elfrida, 3 years old, were bundled under wool blankets and furs. Ebba was between them, wrapped in everything the family could spare. But the cold in that corner was relentless. By the second night, her breathing had become labored. By the third night, she didn't wake when Lovisa tried to feed her warm broth. Zacharias moved her bed closer to the fire on the 3rd day, but the damage was done. Her small body couldn't generate enough heat to fight the cold that had penetrated her core. She died just after midnight, with Lovisa holding her and Zacharias kneeling beside the bed, helpless. They buried her 4 days later when the temperature rose enough to dig through frozen ground. Zacharias marked the grave with stones and a wooden cross carved with her name and dates. He didn't speak much after that. But Zacharias wasn't drowning in guilt. He was drowning in rage at his own ignorance. He had built a cabin that couldn't protect his family, followed every standard practice, and his daughter had frozen to death 20 feet from a burning fireplace. That realization changed him into something neighbors would soon struggle to understand. Zacharias had built his homestead cabin exactly like every other settler in the Dakota Territory. Notched corners, chinked logs, 3 windows, and a door with small steps. But that winter proved that standard construction meant standard death. He wasn't alone in his loss. 2 other families within 10 miles lost children that same winter. Another family lost an elderly grandfather. The cold killed indiscriminately, and the cabins that were supposed to provide shelter offered little more than wind protection. The construction method was universal because it was practical and fast. A man with basic carpentry skills could build a notched log cabin in 10 to 14 days if he worked alone, faster with help. The technique required no specialized tools beyond an axe, a saw, and an auger for drilling. The logs were stacked horizontally with alternating corners notched to interlock. The saddle notch was most common, a rounded depression cut into the top of each log where it would rest on the log below. This created a stable structure that required no nails or metal fasteners. The gaps between logs were filled with chinking, usually a mixture of mud and grass or moss. Some settlers used clay if they could find it. The chinking sealed the obvious openings, but did nothing to address the fundamental problem of thermal conductivity. Wood, even thick pine logs, transferred cold from outside to inside. The logs themselves became conduits for freezing temperatures. Frost would form on the interior surface of exterior walls during extreme cold. The chinking, despite being packed carefully, would crack and shrink as it dried and froze, creating air gaps that allowed wind penetration. Windows were necessary for light, but represented major thermal weak points. Glass was expensive and fragile, so many settlers used oiled paper or scraped hide stretched across frames. Zacharias had splurged on actual glass panes for 2 of his windows, purchased in town at considerable cost. But glass conducted cold efficiently, and the frames inevitably leaked air around their edges. Shutters helped when closed, but a family needed light during the day, which meant opening shutters and accepting heat loss. Doors presented similar problems. The door itself might fit reasonably well, but the threshold and the gap at the top always leaked air. Leather strips or cloth could be tacked around the frame to reduce drafts, but these measures were only partially effective. The small wooden steps leading to the door created another cold bridge where snow could accumulate and cold air could pool. Roofs were typically constructed with rafters or ridge poles, supporting planks or smaller logs laid perpendicular. Over this framework, settlers would layer birch bark if available, then sod. The living sod provided insulation and waterproofing, but it was heavy and required substantial support. Some settlers used wooden shingles if they had access to the right wood and tools. Regardless of material, roofs were usually the best insulated part of the cabin simply because of their mass and layering. Chimneys were built from stone or brick if materials were available, otherwise from mud and sticks. A well-built chimney drew smoke effectively but also drew heat out of the cabin. The draft that removed smoke also pulled warm air from the interior, creating negative pressure that sucked cold air in through every gap and crack in the walls. Zacharias understood all of this now, in retrospect. His cabin was built correctly by every standard frontier measure, and by those same standards, it was inadequate for survival during extreme cold. Standard construction killed his daughter. That was the truth he couldn't escape. Spring 1873 arrived, and while neighbors resumed plowing and planting, Zacharias spent his days walking the prairie sloughs and marshes, staring at cattails with an intensity that worried his wife, Lovisa. He completed his necessary farm work, plowing the fields near the cabin, planting wheat and corn, repairing the small barn where they kept 2 cows and 3 chickens. But every spare hour, he walked south toward the wetlands 3 miles away. The prairie in that region was not uniformly flat. It rolled gently with low areas that collected snowmelt and rain, creating seasonal ponds and permanent marshes. These wetlands were thick with vegetation, cattails, rushes, sedges, and willow shrubs. Most settlers avoided the marshes except to water livestock or occasionally hunt waterfowl. The ground was soft and treacherous. Mosquitoes bred there in enormous numbers during summer. The marshes served no agricultural purpose and were generally considered wasted land. Zacharias saw them differently now. He had started walking to the marshes in late March as soon as the snow melted enough to make travel possible. He told Lovisa he needed to clear his head, needed time alone to think. She understood grief and didn't question him. Wilhelm and Elfrida needed their father present, but they also needed their mother's attention, and Lovisa provided stability while Zacharias wandered. What he was actually doing was studying. He watched how waterfowl built nests in the cattails, weaving the long leaves into bowl-shaped structures that sat just above the waterline. The nests were surrounded by dense stands of cattails that blocked wind. He noticed that ducks and geese returning to these nests in early spring, when ice still floated in the ponds, appeared comfortable. The birds didn't shiver or huddle. They sat calmly in their nests, despite temperatures that still dropped below freezing at night. He cut several cattail stalks and examined them. The plants grew 8 to 10 feet tall in these marshes, with cylindrical stalks about an inch in diameter at the base. The characteristic brown seed head formed at the top of each stalk. But what interested Zacharias was the stalk itself. When he cut through it, he saw that the interior was not solid. The stalk was composed of a tough outer layer surrounding a spongy, porous core. The core was filled with tiny air chambers running the length of the stalk. He took several stalks back to the cabin and studied them for days. He cut them lengthwise, crosswise, and at angles. He dried them and compared dried stalks to fresh ones. He burned a piece in the fireplace to see how it behaved with fire. The dried cattail burned slowly and didn't produce much flame. The spongy core seemed to resist rapid combustion. The air chambers intrigued him most. He understood insulation in basic terms. Trapped air slowed heat transfer. Feathers worked as insulation because they trapped air between their barbs. Fur worked because dense hair created air pockets against the skin. Buildings with thick walls stayed warmer because the mass of material slowed heat movement. What if thousands of cattail stalks, each filled with tiny air chambers, were placed against cabin walls? Would they trap enough air to create meaningful insulation? Lovisa asked what he was doing with the dried marsh grass spread across their table. He said he was thinking about a project. She didn't press for details. Zacharias cut a single cattail stalk and examined its structure for 3 hours, noticing the tiny air chambers running the length of the stem and understanding suddenly how waterfowl built warm nests in freezing marshes. The revelation came not from scientific knowledge, but from simple observation combined with desperate need. He had no education in physics or engineering. He understood cold because it had killed his daughter. He understood that his cabin leaked heat because he had felt it escaping while Ebba died. The cattail stalk in his hands was approximately 3 feet long, cut from the middle section of a mature plant. The diameter was consistent, roughly 1 inch. The outer surface was smooth and firm, almost waxy. When he pressed his thumbnail into it, the surface resisted, but eventually gave way, revealing the spongy interior. This interior material was unlike solid wood. It compressed slightly under pressure, but sprang back when released. It felt similar to dried bread or certain types of fungus he had seen growing on dead trees. He used his knife to cut the stalk lengthwise, splitting it cleanly down the center. The interior revealed a pattern that reminded him of honeycomb, though less regular. Tiny chambers, each perhaps the size of a pinhead, filled the entire cross-section. Some chambers were connected by small passages. Others appeared isolated. The structure was incredibly light for its volume. A 3-foot section of cattail stalk weighed almost nothing. Zacharias held the split stalk close to his face and blew through it gently. Air moved through some sections, but not others. The chambers weren't uniformly connected like a pipe or tube. Instead, they formed a maze of dead-end pockets and partially connected passages. This meant air entering from one side would have to navigate a complex path to exit the other side. Any heat carried by that air would be slowed, absorbed by the material, and dissipated. He thought about the cabin walls. A log 8 inches thick was solid wood. Cold from outside traveled through that solid mass to the inside. There was nothing to interrupt the transfer except the density of the wood itself. But what if the logs were covered with a layer of cattails? Cold air hitting the outside would encounter not solid material but thousands of tiny air chambers. The air in those chambers would act as insulation, creating a barrier between the cold outside and the log walls. The concept wasn't entirely original. Settlers already understood that thick walls insulated better than thin walls. Sod houses, despite their other drawbacks, stayed relatively warm because sod was thick and contained air pockets between soil particles and grass roots. But sod was heavy, dirty, and required substantial structural support. Cattails were light, clean when dried, and could potentially be attached to existing structures without requiring additional support. Zacharias spent the rest of that day cutting more cattails and examining them. He found that stalks from different parts of the marsh had slightly different properties. Cattails growing in deeper water had thicker stalks with larger air chambers. Those from shallower areas were thinner but more numerous. He began forming a mental picture of how many stalks he would need and how they might be arranged on his cabin walls. He measured his cabin walls 16 feet by 24 feet with 8-foot height and calculated he would need approximately 2,000 cattail stalks to create an insulation layer thick enough to trap dead air around the entire structure. The calculation was rough, but based on practical assessment. He paced the perimeter of his cabin, counting his steps and converting them to feet. The 2 long walls were each 24 feet. The 2 short walls were each 16 feet. Total perimeter was 80 feet. Each wall rose 8 feet from ground to eaves, not counting the peaked gable. The 2 long walls provided 384 square feet of surface area. The 2 short walls provided 256 square feet. The total was 640 square feet of wall surface requiring coverage. The gable ends added perhaps another 60 square feet, though Zacharias decided initially to focus only on the main walls where heat loss was greatest. He estimated that cattail stalks bundled together would need to be 6 to 8 inches thick to provide meaningful insulation. Less than 6 inches seemed insufficient based on how quickly he could feel cold, penetrating thin layers of material. More than 8 inches would be wasteful and potentially difficult to attach securely. He settled on 8 inches as his target thickness. A bundle of cattails tied together would cover a vertical strip of wall. Each bundle would need to be 8 feet tall to run from ground level to the eaves. The width of each bundle would depend on how many stalks he tied together. He experimented with different bundle sizes using the cattails he had already cut. A bundle of 50 stalks, tied tightly at top, middle, and bottom, created a sheaf approximately 10 inches wide and 8 inches thick when compressed slightly. If each bundle covered 10 inches of width, he would need approximately 8 bundles per linear foot of wall perimeter. 80 feet of perimeter meant 640 bundles. Each bundle contained 50 stalks. 640 bundles multiplied by 50 stalks equaled 32,000 stalks. That number seemed impossibly high. Zacharias reconsidered his math. Perhaps the bundles didn't need to be quite so thick. If he reduced the thickness to 6 inches instead of 8, he could use fewer stalks per bundle, perhaps 35 or 40 instead of 50. That would reduce the total to approximately 22,000 stalks. Still overwhelming. He approached the problem from another angle. How many cattails could he cut in a day? He walked to the marsh and spent 4 hours cutting. By the end of that time, he had harvested approximately 300 stalks. If he worked efficiently and dedicated full days to cutting, he might harvest 500 to 600 stalks per day. To gather 20,000 stalks would require 33 to 40 days of work. That assumed the marsh had enough cattails. He surveyed the wetlands carefully. The cattail stands were extensive, covering several acres. Thousands of stalks grew within walking distance. Harvesting 2,000 stalks, he revised his estimate downward again based on using thinner bundles and accepting some gaps, would barely dent the marsh population. 2,000 stalks became his working number. It felt achievable. 40 bundles of 50 stalks each, positioned around the perimeter with some overlap at corners and around the 3 windows and door. Late summer 1873, Zacharias began his daily trips to the marshes 3 miles south, cutting cattails at the base, bundling them in sheaves of 50, and hauling them back while his neighbors watched with growing confusion. He started in early August when the cattails had reached full maturity. The plant stood 9 to 10 feet tall, with thick stalks and fully formed seed heads. This was the ideal harvest time, after the stalks had developed maximum structural strength, but before autumn, decay began. His routine became mechanical. He woke before dawn, completed essential farm chores, then walked to the marsh carrying a scythe, leather strips for binding, and a canvas tarp. The walk took 45 minutes across rolling prairie. He would arrive at the marsh edge as sunrise approached, wade into water that was sometimes knee-deep, and begin cutting. The scythe worked well for cattails. A single smooth stroke at the base of each stalk severed it cleanly. He cut in a methodical pattern, working through sections of marsh and leaving cut stalks floating on the water. After cutting for 2 hours, he would gather the floating stalks and drag them to dry ground. There he would sort them by size, discarding any that were damaged or too thin. The acceptable stalks were laid out in groups of 50. Bundling required precision. He placed 50 stalks parallel to each other, aligning them as closely as possible. Then he tied leather strips around the bundle at 3 points, near the top, at the middle, and near the bottom. The leather needed to be tight enough to hold the stalks together, but not so tight that it crushed the hollow stems. Crushed stems would lose their insulating air chambers. Each bundle, when complete, was approximately 8 feet long, 10 inches wide, and 6 inches thick. Transportation was exhausting. He could carry 2 bundles at a time, one over each shoulder. The bundles were light individually, but became heavy after the 3-mile walk back to his homestead. He made 2 trips most days, sometimes 3 if he started early. 4 to 6 bundles per day meant the harvest would take weeks to complete. Neighbors began noticing by the 2nd week. Siegfried Holmgren stopped by one afternoon and asked what Zacharias was doing with marsh grass. Zacharias said he was gathering materials for a project. Siegfried asked what kind of project required wagon loads of cattails. Zacharias said it was an insulation experiment. Siegfried looked at the growing pile of bundled cattails and shook his head. He said it seemed like a waste of good working time. Other neighbors passed by and saw the cattail bundles accumulating. Some asked questions. Most simply stared and continued. The Swedish and Norwegian settlers in this part of the Dakota territory valued proven methods. Experiments with marsh plants didn't fit that worldview. They had crops to tend and winter preparations to complete. Zacharias's obsession with cattails seemed irrational. By late September, Zacharias had harvested and bundled approximately 1,800 cattail stalks organized into 36 bundles. His arms ached from swinging the scythe. His shoulders were sore from carrying bundles. Lovisa asked when the project would be finished. He said soon. She asked what exactly he planned to do with 3 dozen bundles of dried marsh grass. He said he was going to cover the cabin walls. She stared at him for a long moment, then returned to her cooking without comment. Siegfried Holmgren started the nickname when he saw Zacharias's 6th wagon load of marsh grass, and within a week the entire settlement called him Swamp Man, questioning why he wasted time on worthless reeds while good farmland sat neglected. The name first appeared at the community gathering in late September when families met at the Holmgren homestead to help with their harvest. These gatherings were essential for frontier survival. Neighbors helped each other with large tasks like threshing grain or building structures, then shared a meal and news. Zacharias attended because refusing would have been antisocial and potentially damaging to his family's standing in the community. Lovisa brought bread and preserves. Wilhelm and Elfrida played with other children. Zacharias worked alongside other men, operating the hand-crank thresher and bagging wheat. The work was hot and dusty. During a water break, Siegfried made a joke about Swamp Man taking time away from his cattail kingdom to help civilized farmers. The other men laughed. The nickname caught immediately. By the end of the day, everyone was using it. Someone asked if Zacharias planned to weave baskets with all those cattails. Another suggested he might be building a giant duck nest. A third wondered if Swedish people had some traditional use for marsh plants that Norwegians and Germans didn't know about. The jokes weren't malicious, but they were persistent. Zacharias understood that frontier communities operated on conformity and mutual support. Deviation from accepted practices invited scrutiny and mockery. His cattail harvesting deviated significantly. He had spent 6 weeks cutting marsh plants instead of expanding his fields or improving his barn. His yard looked bizarre with bundled cattails stacked in rows. He had given no clear explanation for what he was doing or why. The problem was that he couldn't explain it in terms his neighbors would understand. If he said he was creating insulation, they would point out that his cabin already had walls. If he said he was trying to prevent another death from freezing, they would tell him to burn more firewood. If he mentioned the air chambers in cattail stems and their potential to trap heat, they would look at him like he was inventing fantasy. Frontier settlers trusted what they could see working in practice, not theoretical explanations about air pockets and thermal barriers. So Zacharias accepted the nickname and continued his work. Let them call him Swamp Man. Let them joke about duck nests and basket weaving. He had watched his daughter die because his cabin couldn't hold heat. That memory overrode any concern about social mockery. When winter came and his family stayed warm, the jokes would stop. Or they wouldn't, and that would be acceptable too. He wasn't doing this for approval. The harvest continued through early October. He added another 12 bundles to his collection, bringing the total to 48 bundles containing approximately 2,400 cattail stalks. More than he had originally calculated, but he wanted extra material for corners and around windows where fitting would be difficult. Zacharias built crude racks from scrap lumber and leaned 2,000 cattail bundles at precise angles, creating a golden forest in his yard that children from neighboring homesteads came to mock, and Lovisa endured with silent doubt. The drying process was essential. Fresh-cut cattails contained significant moisture that would promote mold and rot if the bundles were attached to the cabin walls immediately. Proper drying required air circulation around each bundle and protection from direct ground contact where moisture would wick back into the stalks. He constructed the racks using leftover planks from his barn construction and several straight branches he cut from willows near the creek. Each rack was a simple A-frame design, 2 uprights leaning against each other at the top with a crosspiece for stability. He built 12 racks spaced 6 feet apart in rows across his yard. The cattail bundles leaned against these racks at approximately 60-degree angles, which allowed air to flow around them while keeping them stable against wind. The visual effect was dramatic. His homestead, which had looked reasonably normal despite the stacked bundles, now resembled a cattail processing facility. Golden brown stalks surrounded the cabin on 3 sides. The seed heads, still attached to many stalks, created a fuzzy texture that caught afternoon light. The arrangement was methodical and dense. Anyone approaching the property saw cattails before they saw the cabin itself. Children noticed first. Wilhelm and Elfrida's playmates from the Lundberg and Holmgren families would visit and stare at the cattail forest. Some asked if they could play among the racks. Zacharias said no. The drying bundles were not toys. The children invented games anyway, running between the rows and calling it the Swamp Man's Castle. Their parents tolerated this until the novelty wore off after a few weeks. Adult visitors were less amused. Albin Lundberg stopped by in mid-October to borrow a tool and stood looking at the drying racks for several minutes without speaking. Finally, he asked Zacharias how long the marsh grass needed to dry. Zacharias said at least 4 weeks, possibly 6. Albin asked what happened after that. Zacharias said he would attach the bundles to his cabin walls. Albin nodded slowly, thanked him for the tool, and left without further comment. Lovisa's doubt was quieter but more persistent. She didn't mock or question directly, but Zacharias saw her standing at the cabin window sometimes, looking at the drying racks with an expression he couldn't quite read. Concern, perhaps, or embarrassment. She had married a practical man who built a solid cabin and worked his land competently. Now that man spent his time harvesting marsh plants and filling their yard with what looked like elaborate nonsense. The cattails dried slowly through October and into early November. Zacharias checked them daily, feeling the stalks for moisture content and flexibility. By late November, most bundles had dried completely. The stalks had lightened in color from green-brown to golden tan. They felt crisp but not brittle. The hollow interiors had fully desiccated, creating the air-filled chambers he was counting on for insulation. The drying was complete. The application could begin. Starting in mid-September, Zacharias developed his attachment system, leather straps nailed to log ends holding vertical cattail bundles that overlapped like shingles, working methodically from bottom to top, while neighbors openly laughed at his fortress of weeds. He began on the north wall, which faced the prevailing winter winds and would benefit most from insulation. The wall was 24 feet long and 8 feet high, composed of 12 horizontal logs, stacked and notched at the corners. His attachment method was simple but required precision. He started at ground level with the bottom log. Using a hand drill, he bored holes through leather straps at 12-inch intervals. Each strap was approximately 18 inches long and 2 inches wide, cut from old harness leather he had saved. He positioned a strap vertically against the log end, aligned the holes, then drove square-cut nails through the leather into the wood. The strap hung down from the log, creating a vertical anchor point. He placed cattail bundles against the wall, positioning them so the bundle's base rested on the ground and the top reached the eaves. The leather straps wrapped around each bundle at 3 heights, bottom, middle, and top. He secured the straps by tying them tightly, cinching the cattails against the logs. Each bundle hung vertically, held in place by the leather ties. The overlapping pattern was critical. He didn't place bundles directly adjacent to each other. Instead, each bundle overlapped its neighbor by approximately 2 inches, like shingles on a roof. This overlap eliminated gaps where cold air could penetrate between bundles. It also meant that each linear foot of wall required slightly more than one bundle to cover. The work progressed slowly. Positioning each bundle, wrapping the leather straps and tying them securely took approximately 15 minutes per bundle. The north wall required 11 bundles. That meant nearly 3 hours for one wall, not counting the time to drill holes and prepare leather straps. He worked in the mornings when temperatures were tolerable and his hands could still grip tools effectively. By early December, he had completed the north and east walls. The visual transformation was striking. 2 sides of his cabin had disappeared behind thick layers of golden cattails. The logs were no longer visible. The notched corners were buried under overlapping bundles. The structure looked less like a cabin and more like a haystack or a bizarre piece of frontier art. Siegfried Holmgren rode past one afternoon, stopped his horse, and stared for a full minute. Then he called out, asking if Zacharias was building a nest big enough for himself. Zacharias, standing on a ladder while securing a bundle near the eaves, didn't respond. Siegfried laughed and continued riding. That evening, 3 neighbors came by separately, each inventing reasons to visit, but clearly wanting to see the cattail-covered cabin. None asked direct questions. All left shaking their heads. The 3 windows presented the most difficult challenge, requiring precise trimming and fitting of cattail bundles around each frame to maintain insulation, while preserving light and ventilation, work that took 11 days for 3 openings. The 2 windows flanking the front door were relatively straightforward. Each window frame extended approximately 2 inches beyond the log wall surface, creating a protruding lip that complicated bundle placement. Zacharias couldn't simply hang bundles over the windows. That would block all light and defeat their purpose. His solution involved creating custom-fitted bundles for the areas immediately surrounding each window. He measured the space between the window frame and the edge of the wall section where regular bundles would hang. This created a border area approximately 8 inches wide on each side of the window, 6 inches above and 6 inches below. These border areas needed insulation but required cattail bundles cut to specific dimensions. He laid out a standard bundle and used his knife to trim stalks to the required length. For the areas beside each window, he created narrow bundles containing only 25 stalks instead of the usual 50. These thinner bundles fit into the tight spaces between window frames and regular wall coverage. The bundles above and below the windows were even more complex. They needed to be both narrower and shorter, requiring careful cutting and rebundling. The attachment method around windows used the same leather strap system, but required more anchor points to prevent gaps. He drilled holes and installed straps at 6-inch intervals instead of 12, doubling the number of attachment points. This created a secure frame of insulation around each window opening. The cattails pressed firmly against the logs surrounding the glass, sealing the edges where cold air typically penetrated around window frames. The small window in the upper gable presented a different challenge. It was higher than the other 2 and positioned in the triangular space beneath the peaked roof. Ladder work was necessary. Zacharias constructed a simple platform from planks and sawhorses, giving him stable footing while working 8 feet above ground. The gable window was smaller, roughly 12 inches square, but its location in the peak meant surrounding it with insulation required cutting cattails at angles to match the roof slope. He spent an entire day on the gable window alone, trimming bundles to fit the angled space and securing them with leather straps attached to the log framework beneath the roof edge. The result was imperfect. Small gaps remained where the angle was too acute for cattails to fill completely, but it was substantially better than leaving the window area uninsulated. When all 3 windows were complete, Zacharias stood back and examined his work. The windows appeared as dark rectangular openings in a golden wall of cattails. Light still entered the cabin adequately. The shutters could still close if needed, but every inch of wall surrounding the glass was now covered with 6 inches of insulating marsh grass. The thermal weak points that had leaked heat all winter were now protected. The notched log corners created irregular surfaces where cattails couldn't hang uniformly, so Zacharias packed smaller bundles into every gap, creating seamless coverage that eliminated the traditional weak points where cold air penetrated standard cabins. The saddle-notched corners formed a pattern of protruding log ends, each extending approximately 8 inches beyond the intersection. These extensions alternated, one log protruding from the north-south wall, the next from the east-west wall, creating a stepped appearance at each corner. Standard cattail bundles couldn't wrap around these irregular surfaces. If he hung bundles normally, they would bridge across the protruding logs, leaving air gaps of 6 to 8 inches deep behind the cattails. These gaps would create convection currents where cold air could circulate, defeating the insulation purpose. The corners required a different approach. Zacharias' solution was to fill the gaps first, then cover the corners with overlapping bundles from both walls. He created small stuffing bundles containing 15 to 20 cattail stalks, each bundle approximately 12 inches long. These were loose bundles, tied only at the center, allowing the stalks to spread slightly. He pushed these stuffing bundles into every gap created by the protruding log ends, packing them firmly, but not crushing the hollow stems. The stuffing process was tedious. Each corner had 8 gaps where logs protruded, 4 on each side of the corner intersection. Each gap needed 2 or 3 stuffing bundles to fill completely from bottom to top. That meant 24 stuffing bundles per corner, 96 bundles total for 4 corners. He spent 3 full days creating and installing these small bundles. Once the gaps were filled, he addressed the outer corner coverage. The regular cattail bundles from adjacent walls met at each corner. He overlapped them by approximately 6 inches, creating a doubled insulation layer at the corner itself. The leather straps from both walls wrapped around this doubled section, cinching everything together. The result was a corner with no exposed wood, no air gaps, and insulation nearly 12 inches thick where the bundles overlapped. The corners now looked like rounded columns of cattails rather than sharp angles of notched logs. The traditional weak points, where wind typically exploited the gaps in notched construction, were now the most heavily insulated sections of the entire cabin. Zacharias tested his work by feeling the interior walls at the corners during a cold night in early December. Standard cabins had frost forming on interior corners when temperatures dropped below 20 degrees. His corners remained dry and only slightly cool to the touch. The corner solution also addressed the small wooden steps at the front door. The steps were built against the south wall, creating another irregular surface. Zacharias packed small bundles beneath and around the steps, filling the space between the stair structure and the wall. He left the step treads themselves clear for walking, but insulated everything else. The door remained accessible and functional, while the surrounding wall area was fully protected. By mid-October 1873, the cabin was complete, a standard structure made bizarre by 8 inches of cattail coverage, and Siegfried Holmgren announced loudly that Swamp Man had built himself a nest because he'd lost his mind. The transformation was total. What had been a recognizable log cabin with notched corners, 3 windows, and a simple door now looked like a massive haystack with smoke emerging from the top. The cattails covered every surface from ground level to the eaves. Only the roof and chimney remained visible in their original state. The visual effect disturbed neighbors more than Zacharias had anticipated. Frontier settlers built cabins that looked like cabins, rectangular structures with visible logs, clear corners, and obvious doors and windows. Zacharias's dwelling defied that pattern. The golden-brown cattails obscured all familiar architectural elements. The bundles hung in vertical columns, creating a textured surface that shifted slightly in the wind. The overlapping pattern made the walls appear thick and impenetrable. It looked foreign and strange. Siegfried's comment about losing his mind came during a Sunday gathering at the church meeting held in Alban Lundberg's barn. The settlement had no formal church building yet, so families gathered monthly for services led by whichever member felt called to preach that day. After the service, families shared food and conversation. Zacharias attended with Lovisa and the children, knowing his absence would generate more gossip than his presence. During the meal, Siegfried addressed the group loudly enough for everyone to hear. He said he had ridden past the Huestrom place recently and seen the completed project. He said it looked like Swamp Man had built himself a bird's nest big enough to live in. He said grief did strange things to people, and maybe Zacharias needed more time to recover from his daughter's death before attempting construction projects. Several people laughed nervously, others looked uncomfortable. Lovisa's face flushed red. Wilhelm and Elfrida stopped eating. Zacharias continued chewing his bread without acknowledging the comment. After a long silence, Alban Lundberg changed the subject by asking about winter preparations and whether anyone needed help slaughtering hogs before the cold arrived. The conversation shifted, but the damage was done. On the ride home, Lovisa asked quietly if Zacharias thought the cattails would actually work. He said he believed they would. She asked what they would do if the cattails failed, and the cabin was just as cold as last winter. He said the cattails wouldn't fail. She asked how he knew. He said because the air chambers in the stalks would trap heat the same way they kept waterfowl warm in frozen marshes. She didn't respond. The nickname Bridger's Fortress appeared a few days later, though its origin was unclear. Someone had heard about the mountain man Samuel Bridger and his supposedly indestructible cabin in the Rockies. The comparison was meant as mockery. Zacharias had built a fortress against cold using marsh grass, which seemed as ridiculous as building a fortress against bears using pine needles. But the name stuck. Some neighbors called it the Nest. Others called it Bridger's Fortress. Most simply referred to it as that crazy cattail cabin. November brought the first hard freeze, and Zacharias noticed immediately that his cabin required half the firewood of previous winters, while neighbors burned through their wood piles at the usual alarming rate and made jokes about crazy Swedes and their marsh grass houses. The temperature dropped to 18 degrees below zero on November 9th. Zacharias woke that morning expecting the familiar cold that had permeated his cabin every previous winter. Instead, he found the interior surprisingly comfortable. He had lit the fireplace the evening before and maintained a modest fire through the night. In previous winters, this would have kept the area immediately around the hearth tolerable, but left the corners and walls frozen. That morning, the entire cabin felt warm. Not just near the fireplace, but in the corners where Ebba had died, near the windows where frost typically formed, and along the walls where cold used to radiate from the logs. He placed his hand against the interior wall near one of the front windows. The logs felt cool, but not cold. No frost had formed on the surface. He walked to the corner farthest from the fireplace and touched the wall there. Same result, cool but dry, no ice crystals, no bitter cold penetrating from outside. The cattail insulation was working exactly as he had theorized. Over the next 2 weeks, temperatures fluctuated between 10 above and 20 below zero. Zacharias tracked his firewood consumption carefully. In previous winters, he burned approximately 12 to 15 logs per day to maintain minimal warmth. This winter, he was burning 6 to 8 logs per day and maintaining superior comfort. The reduction was significant, 40 to 50% less fuel for better results. The difference was noticeable in daily life. Wilhelm and Elfrida could play on the floor throughout the cabin instead of being confined to the area near the fireplace. Lovisa could work at the table without wearing her heavy coat indoors. At night, the family slept under fewer blankets and woke without frozen breath coating their faces. The morning routine no longer involved huddling by the fire until enough heat accumulated to make dressing tolerable. Zacharias mentioned these observations to no one. He knew that subjective comfort meant nothing to skeptical neighbors. They would need objective proof, a crisis where the cattail cabin performed dramatically better than standard construction. He suspected that crisis would come. Dakota Territory winters were unpredictable and often brutal. Eventually, a storm would arrive that tested every cabin's ability to protect its inhabitants. Meanwhile, he overheard comments from neighbors who visited other families and reported on their observations. Alban Lundberg mentioned to someone that Swamp Man's chimney barely smoked compared to other cabins. Siegfried Holmgren joked that maybe the cattails were so thick they trapped the smoke inside, and Zacharias was slowly suffocating. A German settler named Friedrich Hansen suggested more seriously that perhaps the marsh grass actually did provide some insulation, though he couldn't explain how dried weeds would accomplish that. December arrived with intermittent snow and temperatures that dropped into the 30s below zero during clear nights. Zacharias continued his reduced firewood consumption while neighbors burned through their carefully accumulated wood piles at rates that worried them. January 14, 1874, the blizzard began on a Tuesday morning with temperatures at 20 below zero, and by Wednesday afternoon, the entire settlement was buried under snow that wouldn't stop falling for 37 days. The storm arrived without significant warning. The previous day had been cold but clear. Settlers completed their normal winter routines, feeding livestock, hauling water from wells or creeks, splitting firewood. By Monday evening, high clouds moved in from the northwest. By Tuesday morning, snow was falling heavily. The temperature dropped rapidly, 20 below at dawn, 25 below by midday, 30 below by evening. The wind increased throughout Tuesday, reaching sustained speeds of 40 miles per hour, with gusts significantly higher. Snow fell so heavily that visibility dropped to a few yards. The combination of wind and snow created whiteout conditions that made travel impossible and outdoor work dangerous. By Wednesday morning, drifts had buried fences and obscured the outlines of cabins. Settlers who ventured outside to care for livestock struggled to find their own barns. Some tied ropes between cabin and barn to create guidelines they could follow in the blinding snow. Others simply opened their doors enough to toss hay and water to animals penned in nearby shelters, unable to reach outlying structures. The snow continued through Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Each day brought the same conditions: heavy snow, brutal wind, temperatures between 30 and 40 below zero. Drifts grew to 8, 10, 12 feet high against cabin walls. Chimneys became partially buried, creating draft problems that filled cabins with smoke. Settlers had to climb onto their roofs repeatedly to keep chimney tops clear. Dangerous work in the blinding storm. Inside the cabins, families burned firewood at desperate rates. A typical winter day might require 12 logs to maintain marginal warmth. Storm conditions required 20 or more. The extreme cold, combined with wind that found every gap in the walls, made standard cabins nearly impossible to heat. Families wore every piece of clothing they owned. Children huddled under piles of blankets. Meals were eaten near the fire because food froze within minutes if moved away from the hearth. By the end of the first week, several families had exhausted half their winter firewood supplies. The storm showed no signs of ending. Day 8 brought the same conditions as Day 1. Day 9 was identical. Day 10 brought slightly warmer temperatures, only 20 below instead of 40. But snow continued falling and wind continued blowing. Some families began burning furniture when firewood ran low. Others burned fence rails, tool handles, anything combustible. Zacharias's cabin existed in a different reality. The thick cattail layer created an insulating barrier that wind couldn't penetrate. The hollow stems, now frozen solid on the outside, maintained their internal air chambers. Heat from the modest fire stayed trapped inside the cabin. The interior temperature remained comfortable, not warm by summer standards, but survivably comfortable. Lovisa and the children wore normal indoor clothing. They ate meals at the table. They slept under reasonable numbers of blankets. Zacharias maintained a fire, but burned only 8 to 10 logs per day, less than half what neighbors were consuming. Albin Lundberg broke the unspoken rule of winter isolation and struggled through chest-deep snow to Zacharias's cabin on day 12. Desperate to understand why smoke from the swamp man's chimney was so thin when his own family was burning furniture to survive. The journey from Albin's homestead took nearly 2 hours to cover a distance that normally required 30 minutes. Snow had drifted unevenly across the prairie, creating valleys and ridges. Albin followed fence lines where he could find them, using a long pole to probe for hidden obstacles. He arrived at Zacharias's cabin exhausted and half-frozen. His coat was caked with ice. His beard had frozen into a solid mass. His fingers were numb inside thick mittens. He pounded on the door, unsure if anyone would hear over the wind. Zacharias opened it within seconds. Warm air rushed out into the frozen world, a phenomenon that shocked Albin more than he expected. Inside, Zacharias helped him remove his frozen outer layers and positioned him near the fireplace. A modest fire burned, nothing like the roaring infernos Albin had been maintaining in his own cabin. Yet the interior was warm, not just tolerable, but genuinely comfortable. Lovisa was cooking at the stove without wearing a coat. Wilhelm and Elfrida were playing on the floor in normal clothing. No frost covered the walls, no ice crystals hung from the ceiling. The difference was staggering. Alban sat in silence for several minutes, warming his hands and processing what he was seeing. Finally, he asked how this was possible. Zacharias said the cattails were working as he had hoped they would. Alban asked how dried marsh grass could create this much difference. Zacharias explained about the hollow stems, the air chambers, the dead air insulation layer. He described how heat was trapped inside instead of escaping through the log walls and gaps in the chinking. Alban listened without interrupting. When Zacharias finished, Alban said his own cabin was barely livable, despite burning 25 logs per day. His children were sleeping in one bed with their parents to share body heat. They were eating cold meals because moving food away from the fire meant it froze within minutes. His firewood supply was half gone, and the storm showed no signs of ending. He asked how much wood Zacharias was burning. Zacharias said 8 logs per day. Alban stared at him in disbelief. The conversation continued for an hour. Alban asked detailed questions about the cattail attachment method, the drying process, the coverage around windows and corners. Zacharias answered honestly. He wasn't trying to keep secrets. If other families could benefit from what he had learned, that was acceptable. Alban finally asked if it was too late to add cattails to his own cabin during the storm. Zacharias said yes. Fresh cattails would be impossible to harvest in these conditions, and poorly dried cattails would be worthless for insulation. Alban left that afternoon, struggling back through the snow with the knowledge that his family would likely not survive if the storm continued much longer. 3 days later, the wind finally decreased enough that Zacharias could check on his neighbors. He found Alban's family still alive, but in desperate condition. Zacharias opened his door, and warm air rushed out into the frozen world. His family visible inside, wearing normal clothing, while Alban's children were wrapped in every fabric they owned, and the cattail walls that neighbors had mocked now looked like genius incarnate. The contrast between the two households became the talk of the settlement once communication between families resumed in brief intervals when wind conditions allowed short trips. Word spread through the scattered homesteads about the cattail cabin's performance. Each family compared notes on their survival struggles. The Holmgren family had burned their kitchen table and 4 chairs. The Lundberg family had disassembled their bed frames for fuel. Friedrich Hansen had torn boards from his barn's interior walls. Every household reported the same desperate pattern: insufficient heat despite consuming firewood at rates that would exhaust supplies before spring. Only the Sjostrom cabin maintained comfort while using half the normal fuel consumption. The mockery that had defined community attitudes toward the Cattail project vanished almost overnight. The nickname Swamp Man stopped being used as an insult. Bridger's Fortress started sounding like a compliment. Neighbors who had openly questioned Zacharias' sanity now asked detailed questions about his construction method. Siegfried Holmgren, who had been the most vocal critic, made the journey to Zacharias' cabin during a brief calm period on day 19. He didn't apologize directly for his previous mockery, but he asked permission to examine the exterior cattail coverage. Zacharias agreed. Siegfried walked around the cabin slowly, studying how the bundles were attached, how they overlapped, how corners and windows were handled. He pressed his hand against the cattail layer and noted how little wind penetrated. He examined the interior walls and confirmed no frost formation. He asked if Zacharias thought it was possible to add cattails to an existing cabin after winter ended. Zacharias said yes. That was exactly what he had done. His cabin was standard construction from 1870, and he had added cattails in autumn of 1873. Siegfried nodded and said he would like detailed instructions when weather permitted longer conversations. Other neighbors made similar visits as the storm continued. The blizzard had become endurance test rather than short-term crisis. By day 20, everyone understood this was unprecedented. By day 25, some families were discussing abandoning their cabins and attempting to reach town, a desperate measure that would likely result in death. By day 30, 3 families had lost members. 2 children, and 1 elderly man to cold-related illness and exhaustion. The Sjöström family remained healthy and comfortable throughout. Zacharias maintained his modest fire. Lovisa continued normal cooking. The children played and slept without suffering. The cattail insulation performed exactly as Zacharias had theorized. The hollow stems created millions of air pockets that trapped heat. The thick layer prevented wind penetration. The overlapping pattern eliminated gaps. The corner and window treatments sealed traditional weak points. The proof was undeniable and observable by anyone who visited. Standard frontier cabin construction, despite being accepted practice for decades, was inadequate for extreme conditions. A simple modification using free natural materials solved the problem completely. When the blizzard finally broke in late February, 3 families had lost members to freezing. Every household had exhausted their winter fuel supplies, and Zacharias's cabin had consumed 1/10 the firewood of any neighbor while maintaining comfortable interior warmth throughout. The storm ended as abruptly as it had begun. On the morning of day 37, the wind stopped. Snow ceased falling. The temperature remained brutally cold, 35 below zero, but the absence of wind made the cold manageable. Settlers emerged from their cabins to assess the damage. Snowdrifts had completely buried some structures. Only chimneys and roof peaks marked the locations of certain homesteads. Livestock had died in barns and pens, frozen or suffocated under collapsed shelters. Fences were destroyed. Stored grain and supplies were depleted. The human toll was severe, but could have been much worse. The Holmgren family had lost their youngest child, a 3-year-old boy, on day 32. Despite their best efforts to keep him warm, the sustained cold and inadequate nutrition had weakened him until pneumonia took hold. Friedrich Hansen's elderly father, who lived with the family, died on day 28. The Bergstrom family, recent arrivals who had built a minimal sod house, lost both parents, leaving 3 orphaned children who were taken in by neighbors. Fuel exhaustion was universal except for the Sjöström household. Albin Lundberg had burned every piece of furniture, all his spare lumber, parts of his interior walls, and was preparing to burn floorboards when the storm finally ended. Siegfried Holmgren had exhausted his woodpile by day 26 and spent the final 11 days burning anything combustible, including tools with wooden handles and part of his plow. Other families reported similar desperate measures. Zacharias conducted an inventory of his own firewood supply. He had started the winter with approximately 200 logs. By late February, he had consumed roughly 120 logs total for the entire winter, including the 37-day blizzard. He had 80 logs remaining, enough to last through March and into April, if needed. His consumption during the blizzard averaged 8 logs per day while maintaining interior temperatures that neighbors burning 25 logs per day couldn't achieve. The mathematical difference was stark. Neighbors had consumed approximately 925 logs during the 37-day blizzard. Zacharias had consumed roughly 296 logs for the same period. His cattail insulation reduced fuel requirements by approximately 68% while providing superior comfort. Community gatherings resumed once travel became possible. The first meeting was somber, focused on burying the dead and assessing which families needed immediate assistance to survive until spring. But conversations inevitably turned to the cattail cabin and its remarkable performance. Zacharias found himself answering the same questions repeatedly. How many cattails did he harvest? How long did drying take? What attachment method did he use? Could cattails be added to existing cabins or only new construction? He answered every question honestly and completely. Several men took notes. Women asked if the cattails attracted mice or created fire hazards. Zacharias said he had seen no evidence of mice nesting in the dried stalks, and the cattails burned slowly when tested, less readily than dry grass or hay. By autumn 1874, 7 families were harvesting cattails from the prairie sloughs, and within 5 years, the phrase cattail cabin became synonymous with survival in the Dakota Territory, though Zacharias Sjöström's name faded from memory, while his technique saved dozens of lives across the northern plains. The transformation happened organically, without promotion or formal instruction. Neighbors who had survived the 37-day blizzard understood viscerally that standard cabin construction was inadequate. The cattail solution was visible, replicable, and required no specialized skills or expensive materials. Albin Lundberg was the first to adopt the technique. He began harvesting cattails in August 1874, following the same methods Zacharias had used. By October, his cabin walls were covered with vertical bundles of dried marsh grass. Sigfrid Holmgren started his harvest in September, working with 2 of his older sons to accelerate the process. Friedrich Hansen and 3 other families began their cattail projects that same autumn. The technique spread beyond the immediate settlement. Travelers passing through the area noticed the unusual cattail-covered cabins and asked questions. Word reached other Norwegian and Swedish settlements 20 and 30 miles away. By 1876, cattail insulation was appearing on cabins throughout the eastern Dakota Territory. By 1878, the method had spread to Minnesota and into the Canadian territories. The phrase cattail cabin entered local vocabulary as a descriptor for any dwelling that could withstand extreme cold. When settlers discussed cabin construction, they differentiated between standard cabins and cattail cabins, the way they differentiated between sod houses and log structures. The term carried connotations of superior planning, cold weather resilience, and practical innovation. Variations emerged as different builders adapted the technique. Some used thicker bundles spaced farther apart. Others experimented with horizontal rather than vertical hanging. A few tried mixing cattails with other marsh plants like bulrush or sedge. Most modifications worked adequately, though vertical hanging with 6 to 8 inch thickness remained the most common approach because it was proven effective. Zacharias himself made no effort to promote his innovation or claim credit. He continued farming his land, raising his surviving children, and maintaining his cabin. Neighbors asked his advice occasionally, and he provided it willingly. But he never presented himself as an expert or inventor. He was simply a man who had solved a specific problem using available materials and basic reasoning. The winter of 1879 brought another severe blizzard, not as long as the 37-day storm, but equally cold. This time, no families in the settlement lost members to freezing. The cattail cabins performed as expected, maintaining interior warmth with manageable fuel consumption. Standard cabins still existed, but were becoming less common as older structures were modified or replaced. Zacharias Sjöström died in 1896 at age 53 from pneumonia unrelated to cabin temperature. He was buried beside his daughter Ebba in the small cemetery that had grown up near the church. His gravestone listed his name, dates, and the simple inscription, husband and father. No mention was made of cattails or insulation or the innovation that had changed frontier construction across the northern plains. His cabin stood for another 40 years, the cattails eventually rotting and being replaced by later occupants, until the structure was finally abandoned in the 1930s, when the land was consolidated into larger farms. But the principle he had proven, that simple natural materials properly applied could solve life-threatening problems, continued influencing construction techniques long after his name was forgotten.